We've got a lot to get to this morning. The Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy is here. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee, so I've got a lot of questions for him as new details start to emerge about the classified documents that the FBI seized from Donald Trump's Florida golf club. Plus, President Biden laid out in clear and alarming terms the threat to our democracy posed by the so-called MAGA Republicans who worship at the altar of an insurrectionist ex-president who peddles lies and encourages political violence. But for whom was the president's message? Is truth-telling and getting out the vote enough to turn things around? Jelani Cobb and Michael Beschloss assess the status of the battle for the soul of the nation 2 months away from the critical midterm elections. And later in the show, a very special edition of the Velshi Band Book Club featuring the one and only Margaret Atwood. But we begin this hour with a sometimes controversial presidential power, the power of the pardon. The U.S. Constitution bestows a handful of rights to the American president, one of which is the, quote, power to grant reprieve and pardons for offenses against the United States, end quote. We've seen countless presidents over the centuries use this authority for good, often giving mercy to those who were wrongfully convicted, or in more modern times, those who were simply railroaded by the criminal justice system. But like almost all legal and constitutional norms in this country, this one has been complicated in the era of Donald Trump. Now, let's be clear. Donald Trump did not issue a lot of pardons. In fact, he issued fewer than most other presidents, which makes it all the more concerning when you look at how many of Trump's pardons carried the stink of political patronage at best and corrupt self-interest at worst. According to Pew Research Center, over the course of his 4 years in office, Trump only granted 237 acts of clemency. That's the third lowest number of pardons for any president in history. Only the two President Bushes pardoned fewer people. So it would seem that Trump was extremely selective about whom he pardoned. Still, some of his pardons were widely praised, like Alice Johnson in 2020, who was serving life in prison for a nonviolent drug conviction. He posthumously pardoned the historical figure Susan B. Anthony, arrested for voting illegally in 1872, and Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight boxing champ who was subject to a racist conviction in 1913 for transporting a white woman across state lines. But he also pardoned a rogues gallery of political figures, including many of his own associates, some of whose convictions were directly related to Trump's own interest. You may recall some of these bigger names whose sentences Trump either commuted or pardoned altogether. Steve Bannon, Trump's former chief strategist in the White House and the CEO of his 2016 campaign, convicted of defrauding donors to a privately funded effort to build Trump's border wall. Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor, who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI as part of the Trump-Russia investigation. Paul Manafort, Trump's 2016 campaign chairman, who was convicted of financial fraud. Roger Stone, a friend and advisor to Trump, who was convicted for lying under oath to Congress and threatening a witness as part of attempts to impede the Russia investigation. Charles Kushner, the father of Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who pleaded guilty in 2004 to 16 counts of tax evasion. Donald Trump is no longer free to abuse pardon power because he's no longer the president, but he's actually still trying. Trump has, of course, been broadly hinting at another run for the presidency in 2024, and he's now saying out loud that if he wins the presidency again, he will look to pardon those convicted of storming the Capitol on January 6th. Not just full pardons with an apology. NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley points out that Trump's eldest son, Don Jr., is essentially helping fundraise for some of the defendants. The younger Trump retweeted the link to a crowdfunding site for a rioter who attacked police officers on camera and then bragged about the importance of the violence. Now, call me crazy. I don't think any of these January 6 defendants should expect financial support anytime from Donald Trump, considering he won't even help pay the mounting legal expenses for his own pit bull, Rudy Giuliani. But friends, this is actually serious. It doesn't sound it, but it's serious, because the dangling of pardons for those who committed violence in the name of Donald Trump on January 6th, Donald Trump is sending a message to the next insurrectionist mob. He's letting anyone who might consider that kind of political violence know, I got your back. Joining me now is Hugo Lowell, a congressional reporter for The Guardian who covers the January 6th insurrection and the Trump investigations. Hugo, good morning to you. Thank you for being with us. I thought it was a joke when I first heard that he had said this on a radio show. I've never, ever heard of any historical example of someone saying, when I become president, I will issue pardons to specific people.
Yeah, and I think that's because, right, there's no parallel here. We've never had a president who has effectively incited his own supporters to attack the Capitol, and then in promising a return to the presidency has said, don't worry, we'll let you all off, despite some of you being convicted for things like seditious conspiracy. So I think that there are no parallels here. It reinforces how Trump likes to dole these pardons out. It's for people he believes are, sufficiently loyal to him and don't cooperate with investigators. I mean, if we go back to the pardon that Trump issued at the end of his term, like all those people, you earlier mentioned, these were all people, and also before, right? These are all people that didn't cooperate with the Russia investigation. They're all people that didn't cooperate with Congress. I mean, people like Roger Stone, people like Paul Manafort, these are all people that Trump suggested to them, look, if you cooperate or don't cooperate against investigators, then I will save you at the end. And this seems to be an exact repeat of that behavior.
So in the abstract, it's weird and terrible, and there's no historical parallel, but it's not in the abstract, because last night Donald Trump delivered a speech in Pennsylvania in which he riled up his supporters using language that was quite inflammatory, calling President Biden and Democrats the enemies of the state, and saying that they don't have a right to take this country from you. So when you combine rhetoric that either incites violence or at least incites massive political polarization with the dangling of pardons for people who actually used violence to overcome an election, you have a dangerous brew here.
Look, I think that's right. And at the start of the Trump presidency, I don't think anyone believed for a moment that anyone would storm the Capitol. And, there was you got a lot of free passes from people saying, this is just political rhetoric. This is just what politicians do. Except then on January 6th, we actually had people act upon what Trump was saying. And he now knows, and people around the former president acknowledge this, Trump now knows if he says certain things, if he says them in a particularly belligerent manner, his supporters will take that to be the literal truth, and they will go and act on it. He now knows he has this power and this authority to kind of compel his supporters to do things that they might not otherwise do for any other political candidate. And so when he starts making these kinds of comments at rallies, when they're already at the supercharged environment, his supporters are already crazy and devoted to him, then I think you've laid the groundwork. Let's say for the next presidential election, that if he loses, then you have the seeds here of a potential repeat of January 6th.
And, of course, the complicating factor, he was in Pennsylvania at a rally for Doug Mastriano. Pennsylvania is almost a mirror of Arizona right now. They've got a senatorial candidate and a gubernatorial candidate, both of whom are election deniers, both of whom have said, if we become the governor, we will take actual actions to undo prior elections or take control of election systems. So this is, again, not an abstraction. It's possibly politically violent talk. It's combined with an election that could actually help overturn an election.
Yeah, and if you just take a look at Arizona, for instance, because that's kind of that's the state where we have election deniers who are kind of more forthright in this, perhaps. People like Mark Fincham, he's a member of the Oath Keepers. He's a member of these far-right groups that were directly involved in January 6th, but directly involved in storming the Capitol. I mean, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, these were two far-right groups that really led the way into breaking into the Capitol. And he was a direct sympathizer and a direct member of them. And he's continuing to say that the election was stolen and that he wants to decertify the results. I mean, this is not theoretical. These are people, and I've spoken to Mark Fincham, these are the kinds of people who genuinely believe that the election was stolen and want to decertify President Biden's victory. And the fact that you have these people running for office in the next election, I think, is deeply concerning.
It is not theoretical, as you point out. Hugo, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Hugo Lowell is a congressional reporter for The Guardian. Joining me now is the Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy from Illinois. He's the member of the House Intel Oversight and Reform Committees. Congressman, good morning to you. Thank you for being with us. It's good to see you, as always. Let's pick up exactly where I left off with Hugo. It's not theoretical. The stuff that Donald Trump has been saying, the dangling of pardons, the encouragement of the language he uses with his supporters, The idea that we have 5 senatorial candidates, Republican candidates who are a little bit wackadoodle, and states like Arizona and Pennsylvania, which are on the line with gubernatorial candidates who are election deniers. This isn't theoretical. All of this stuff is actually real and potentially dangerous in 2 months from now.
That's right. I think that with the dangling of the pardons, one thing that we talked about repeatedly during the Trump administration when he was president was that he often did this as a signaling tool to keep people quiet. And I think that this might even be a signaling tool toward people who might cooperate with the January 6th committee, with the Justice Department and any number of investigations of him, or even the Georgia or New York proceedings. And then secondly, I think you're absolutely right. He is trying to, he's gone full MAGA at this point. He has decided that he's going to deny that he committed any wrongdoing or call whatever he did in terms of wrongdoing justified. And he's going to get people so riled up in his corner that I fear that they're going to commit violence. And this kind of use of political violence potentially is even more dangerous to our republic right now.
Let me ask you about the search on Mar-a-Lago and the politicization of it. There are a lot of people now saying that at the very least it's a technical breaking of the law that should be pursued. I think as an Intel committee person, you'd say it's much more serious than that. It's not the technical breaking of the law. It's the idea that there might be names and sources who are out there. But there are others who say whatever it is that gets Donald Trump prosecuted is going to lead to major, deeper fissures in our political system. How do you address that fear?
I think the Justice Department and the FBI have to do their jobs outside of any other considerations. But going to your initial point, this is not a case of an overdue library book. This is not sloppy bookkeeping. This is a staggering refusal and willful retention of hundreds of classified documents, often containing exquisite information bearing on our national security. I think the biggest theme here, Ali, is how do we guard our national security? And how do we guard it when a former president willfully refuses to treat classified documents properly and then resists returning them when he's specifically asked to do so? And so that is a huge problem. And then, of course, we're conducting simultaneously a damage assessment with regard to how those documents may have damaged our national security and what we can do to mitigate that and prevent it from happening in the future.
Congressman, let me ask you about this mystery around these files that were found, empty files. They had top secret or, designations on them. It was fascinating to see the photographs that came out of the inventory that these are not, there's no chance you could mistakenly have taken these things out of the White House thinking that maybe they contained other things. That said, intelligence experts have said don't make too much of the fact that these files were found empty because it's quite likely that they were used for transportation and that the stuff therein or that was therein, the 10 or 11,000 documents that were found were just separate from the files. I know that you're an Intel committee guy, so you can only tell me so much without killing me. But what do you make of that analysis?
We're not going to kill you, Ali. So the issue here is we just don't know the answer to the question of what was in those empty file folders. But there are dozens and dozens, I think more than 40 that had the classified document banner on them. We don't know what was supposed to be in those documents based on the published reports, but there's also dozens and dozens, I think more than 40 folders that said return to military aid. So that obviously suggests that there were documents related to defense matters. And I think that's what is connected to that statute that's invoked in the warrant with regard to the Espionage Act. That's the willful retention, concealment, or destruction of documents related to defense matters. And when you then say that many of these are top secret or TSSCI, the highest classification of intelligence, that's what gets people's eyebrows raised and people very, very concerned about the situation.
You've had to look. Have you had occasion to look at TSS SC files? Like you that process is not. This would not end up at your house accidentally.
No, I've never reviewed any of these except in a secure facility underneath the Capitol, in a bunker guarded by armed police officers. And also, they take inventory of these documents. They have people standing, watching as you review these documents to make sure they retrieve them upon completion of the review. They are often related to covert programs, human intelligence sources, the electronic monitoring of foreign communications and the like. So this is what's called the most exquisite of intelligence that the intelligence community keeps.
Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for being with us, especially on this Labor Day weekend. Congressman Roger Krishnamurthy of Illinois. All right, thank you, sir. And coming in a 1776 letter to a fellow revolutionary, John Adams worried that the risk of a demagogue who could exploit public anxieties would always pose a threat to popular government. 2 months before the country would declare its independence from the British Crown, John Adams, who would go on to become the second president of the United States, warned ominously, quote, "We may please ourselves with the prospect of free and popular governments, but I fear that in every assembly, members will obtain an influence by noise, not sense, by meanness, not greatness, by ignorance, not learning, by contracted hearts, not large souls. There is one thing, my dear sir, that must be attempted and most sacredly observed, or we are all undone. There must be a decency and respect, or we are undone. In a popular government, this is the only way of supporting order," end quote. 246 years later, the American experiment finds itself threatened by the noise that John Adams warned about: political violence, bullying, disinformation stoked by an agitator who believes he's bigger than the republic. Not since the Civil War has the nation faced an internal nation. Biden called out this danger by name.
Too much of what's happening in our country today is not normal. Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic. History tells us that blind loyalty to a single leader and a willingness to engage in political violence is fatal to democracy. This is inflammatory. It's dangerous. It's against the rule of law. And we, the people, must say, this is not who we are.
For the first time in his presidency, Biden pointedly and forcefully called out the threat. Trump fired back at Biden's comments during a rally on Saturday in Pennsylvania.
Joe Biden came to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to give the most vicious, hateful, and divisive speech ever delivered by an American president, vilifying 75 million citizens plus another probably 75 to 150, if we want to be accurate about it, as threats to democracy and as enemies of the state. You're all enemies of the state. He's an enemy of the state. You want to know the truth?
Leaders of the far-right MAGA movement also responded, calling Biden's comments a declaration of war. The Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz tweeted, "Did Joe Biden just declare war on red state America? Sure hope not." Congresswoman and resident Republican conspiracist Marjorie Taylor Greene demanded that Biden be removed from office. Quote, "Joe Biden just declared all of us enemies of the state. Biden is a danger to us all. Joe Biden must be impeached." All right, after the break, we're joined by two of America's most brilliant democracy, or two brilliant American historians. Michael Beschloss is an NBC News presidential historian. He's the host of Fireside History on Peacock and the author of many books, including an important one called Presidents of War, the epic story from 1807 to modern times. Dr. Jelani Cobb is a PhD in American history. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's the dean of the Columbia Journalism School and author of the book, The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Jelani, let me start with you. I thought of you guys because of the speech on Thursday night, but so much has happened since, including the speech last night, Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump dangling the idea of pardons for those who've been convicted in January 6th. It seems like we're coming unraveled just in the last couple of days. So give me your sense of the last few days and where we are.
So, I mean, I think that we should be mindful of just how extraordinary this moment is. The speech that Joe Biden gave, first, this was Joe Biden giving the speech, the person who has defined moderation and centrism throughout his extensive political career in the United States. But we've reached a point where even he has become alarmed by the tenor of everything that's happened. And that should be alarming for the rest of us as well, in addition to the things that he was actually responding to. January 6th, the heated rhetoric about civil war and insurrection that has followed in the aftermath of the raid at Mar-a-Lago. All sorts of things that are vectors of significant danger, for democracy. And I think that the other part of it is that, in him giving this speech, it would be easy to make a kind of false equivalency between the kind of calling out that he's done and the calling out that Donald Trump has historically done, and pointed to dangers that the opposing party presents to society. The difference, I think, and the distinction here is the actual array of facts that Joe Biden is relying on in making that argument.
Michael, let's talk. I mean, I'm going to ask the same question of you. Where do you think we are in the last few days?
I think Jelani said it perfectly. And I think the other thing is that, compare it in history, go back to 1860, the eve of the Civil War. We're not on the eve of a national civil war between two armies, but this country is terribly divided. And talking about, the criticism that Trump made of Joe Biden for being divisive, well, Abraham Lincoln said in 1858, as we all know, this country can't survive as a house divided, half slave and half free. That's about as divisive as you can get. That's what presidents do in times like this. And the same thing with Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, when Americans were just almost at each other's throats over, do we possibly go to war against Hitler and the fascists, or do we not? And, I love the fact that you mentioned John Adams, the system that John Adams and James Madison and Hamilton and the other founders built said that we are depending on a president, being elected of great character who desires to unify the country and frame the issues for the people so that they consider them. And instead of what we've got, Donald Trump implying he's going to run for president again, hawking pardons as if they were Trump steaks, and suggesting that if he were president, he would inspire domestic violence, and I should say domestic terrorism, although he doesn't call it that, and even threatening doing that if the Department of Justice should indict him or someone around him.
What stood out to me? Yeah, go ahead.
Add something really quickly to that. I'm glad you brought up that House divided speech that Abraham Lincoln gave, because in the midst of this, there were two speeches that I thought about when Joe Biden gave that speech last week. And the first was the House divided speech. The other was a speech given by William Henry Seward about 4 months after that, which was the irrepressible conflict speech. And right. Both of them make these points that are really pertinent to what we're thinking about now. These speeches were given 2 years before the start of the Civil War. 3 years before the start of the Civil War. But the fact of it is that they had pointed to the limits of politics. So we had reached the limits of politics and how politics could resolve the divisive issues of the day. And Biden is essentially saying, we may not be at that point now, but we're at a place where we need to be mindful that we can come to those kinds of disastrous circumstances.
On a more simple basis, Michael, one of the things I heard in the speech was when in Donald Trump's response last night was when he referred to Joe Biden as the enemy of the state. That's been repeated by a number of people. We went through 4 years where he called the media the enemy of the people. That rhetoric worked. It really did work. Nobody can tell us in the media it didn't work. Trust in the media, which was already in decline, continued to plummet, and people decided that they were going to just stay in their own silos. When he says this stuff, it's not just rhetoric. This guy has a lot of power to make people, particularly people who already follow him, but in conservative echo chambers, believe it and act on it. Michael. Oh, All right, Jelani, I'm giving that to you because I think we got a technical problem with Michael. The same question goes to you.
Absolutely. And in my position as dean of a journalism school, this is one of the things that we're very concerned about. That we have students who will be reporting in this kind of context, a kind of fact-free context, or as I've been calling, an a la carte reality, where people place reality next to factual reality, next to conspiracy theories, and those things are given kind of equal weight. And the immense difficulty that presents for actually doing what the press is supposed to do, informing the public, not to mention the element of danger that this exacerbates. And that's something that we've been loath to talk about, but it's an actual reality.
He actually went further in the same speech. Donald Trump linked the Department of Justice's criminal investigation of his actions directly to his supporters. He said, "It was not just my home that was raided. It was the hopes and dreams of every citizen who I've been fighting for since the moment I came down the golden escalator in 2015, wanting to represent the people." The golden escalator, of course, referring to Trump Tower. That's when he came down the escalator. Michael, it's remarkable. I mean, Donald Trump is turning what is either, in the very best case, a technical crime of documents being removed from where they weren't supposed to be, in the very worst case, something substantially more dangerous to national security, and turning it into not just the witch hunt, the language he uses, but an attack on the American people, an attack on anyone who ever supported Donald Trump. In the old world, if someone you supported committed a crime, you might say, "Hey, I'm done with you." Donald Trump is actually making this about everybody who supports him.
No, exactly. And he's looking for where the power is. And, you were talking about Donald Trump referring to Joe Biden and people who like him as enemies of the state. And I'll say something I didn't expect to say on your program or anyone else, and in the presence of Jelani, and that is, here Donald Trump is really using history, but the problem is the history he's using is not American history, it's Soviet history. That's what Stalin and the Stalinists used to say about people who stood in their way. And in the case of Stalin, as we tragically know, millions of people were killed. I don't think there's a remotely, thank God, chance of that happening now, but these things do have very dark echoes, just as you were saying.
Guys, thank you for your input. This is a good conversation that we will have many times, sadly. Michael Beschloss is NBC News presidential historian. Jelani Cobb is a staff writer for The New Yorker and the dean of the Columbia Journalism